All right, Jordan, 8:02. I'm going to get started. Sound good?
That works for me, Joe. You hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good. All right. Welcome, everyone. This is the June edition of our PIP-MG webinar series. Thanks a lot for joining another great session today. I'm excited to have Jordan join us today, and I'll introduce him, and I'll talk about a little bit about his presentation to introduce it. Wanted to let you know this session is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the PIP-MG website, as well as the slides. So Jordan will send us a PDF of the slides, and I'll post those too. So no need to take notes. Everything will be there available for you on the PIP-MG website a day or two after the session today. Okay, a few more notes here. I want to share my screen and talk about some of the upcoming events. Okay, so we've done a lot this year already. You can see we started back in February. We kicked off the series this year. In March, we had a session with Tom Heaps Nelson about the portfolio optimization maturity curve, and he talks about assessing your PMO maturity and ways to fill the gaps and bring your maturity to the next level. In the end of March, we had Claudia Campbell-Matlin. She talked about device development and how to apply Agile to devices. And she also tied in how pharma can take advantage of some of their experiences using Agile and device development. So that's a good one to check out, also on the website. Recently, John gave a presentation about the interface between project and alliance management and the share of information between the two functions and the distinction between the two functions. Had some good discussion towards the end of that on, do companies need to have separate roles or can they be the same person? And so check that one out too. The conference that recently completed in the UK, there'll be some outputs from that coming soon. That was about lessons learned in project management. Can you teach an old dog new tricks? All right, and just recently, a couple of days ago, Karen Skinner did a joint presentation with APM. What impact do you have on this world? And this is focused on the work that she does at LifeArc, and was co-presented. And I forget the name of the co-presenter, but really great presentation, and I recommend everyone check it out. We get so focused on drug development, and for those of us on the commercial side, we're focused on generating revenues. She presents a different perspective and creating a vision for a company as a nonprofit, but also providing therapies for patients. So great presentation there. Here today we have Jordan, and we'll introduce his topic in a few minutes. We have a few more sessions coming up towards the end of the year. In July, we'll talk about decision-making and establishing a decision-making framework in a small to mid-sized company. That'll be with Sarah Hudson. In August, we'll talk about creating a project management methodology for early research companies. So these are preclinical companies where project management is sometimes viewed as impeding on innovation. Towards the end of the year, we have more presentations, how to build a plane while flying it, again with Karen Skinner, and then building high performance teams and assessing your PM maturity, and that's with Mike Florence from Pateros. And keep in mind, there is another conference at the end of the year in London. This one's about cell and gene therapies. So if you're in that space or interested in that space, be on the lookout for future registrations. So a lot going on this year. It's very exciting. And now we'll turn towards Jordan in our presentation today. So I've known Jordan for about 10 years. We worked at Forest together years ago, and he'll tell you about his background a little bit and how Forest transitioned to several other companies. And I followed his career through that time, and now he's as VP at TrialSpark. He was brought in that role to convert the company from a CRO into a sponsor-based drug development company. So he's going to tell us about that experience. And while it might be unusual, and many of us won't be in that opportunity of converting a CRO to a sponsor company, the lessons learned there are very applicable to what we do as, assessing our PMO, building our project management capabilities, informing the organization on what project management does. And so I think Jordan has some great insights, and will go through his presentation today. It'll be an interactive presentation. We have about 20 people on the call. If you have questions, put them in the chat and we can have a discussion as we go through. So I think, Jordan, you have about 40 minutes of slides and we'll have time at the end or time throughout for discussion. Sound good?
That sounds great, Joe. Thank you so much. Let me get my slides shared up here for you. All right. Can you see the full slide set, folks? Joe, can you see everything? Or are you
Yep,
still seeing
good.
the presented view? You're good. All right, great. So why don't we get started? First off, thanks, Joe, for the introduction. I'll tell you a bit more about myself in a few minutes. I think, Joe, in fact, it's probably going back almost 15 or 16 years that we've known each other. Going back to we were both more junior. I had far more hair during our days at Forest. I think you were still kind of coming into the industry, and so was I. And so great getting to know you then and over the course of these years, and I appreciate the kind words. And so here is really a unique presentation, I believe, that we haven't seen before, and it's probably because most of us haven't gone through something like this. But I think to Joe's point, there's going to be lessons learned here regarding change management, organizational cultural shifts, new opportunities that I think are going to be applicable no matter kind of where we are as project managers and project leaders across our careers. And so just again, my name is Jordan Latiner. I am a vice president of program management at TrialSpark. Today's topic is titled The Shift from CRO to Sponsor, Building a Sponsor-Focused PMO in an Unfamiliar World. Really happy to be here in front of the PIPMG organization. Thank you to Joe. Thank you to the PIPMG board for inviting me to present. I'm, again, really excited to be here and helping to bolster and support what's really an emerging group that I'm really excited to be a part of. So thanks, everybody on the PIPMG side for supporting this. And so just a bit of a disclaimer, the views that are going to be expressed today are mine. They are not of any companies that I represent or companies that I have represented in the past, excuse me. And so, just keep that in mind. And so a little bit about sort of who am I? Joe gave a little bit of an introduction. Currently based in New Jersey. My office is based in New York City. Background really heavily based in the sciences, but also with some business administration experience picked up over the years with an MBA. Been a PMP since 2014. As Joe mentioned, I first met him when I started at Forest around 2005, and ultimately that led me through a 16-year career. Began at Forest, moved over to a company called Activists. Activists was a combination of a generics manufacturer plus Forest Labs. Ultimately became Allergan, so it was a pretty large takeover and merger opportunity I was a part of. And then finally, it came to an end for me after about a year with AbbVie. So 16-year career there. Began my first sort of half of my career really primarily in clinical operations and clinical development. For those of you who are really familiar, I actually started in the field as a CRA, clinical research associate. That was my first really foray into the industry, and then moved in-house, so to speak, where I began playing a leading role as a first clinical scientist, playing a role in clinical development, clinical operations, managing trials. And then sort of around 10, 12 years ago, I began sort of a transition out of clinical development into project management, portfolio management, and asset leadership. And so I spent really the last 10 years in those spaces as really both what you call a core team leader or a program head part of the time, and then leading a portfolio management group at Allergan into AbbVie. And so coming into TrialSpark has been my first real major experience in a CRO type environment, and we're going to talk more about that transition in a few minutes. So that's just a little bit about me. I have never worked before at a CRO, as you can see, but like many of you, I've worked with many CROs in the past, often hiring them and hiring, overseeing, managing, and collaborating. So they play obviously an important role in the ecosystem that we have here. Next slide here. So why don't we start? I'm going to have Joe pull up a couple of questions that will help me understand who the audience is today. It may help me refine the presentation a bit and also get to know a little bit more about each of you individually. And so a couple of questions here, if you wouldn't mind answering.
All right, Jordan, responses are coming in now. Give it a minute here. Okay, I'll give it about 10 more seconds.
Sure. I need some Jeopardy music, Joe.
Yeah, there you go.
And I should have clarified, when I work saying directly for a CRO, I mean actually being employed by the CRO, not hiring a CRO to do work on your behalf.
All right, looks like we have a majority in. I'm going to end the poll and share the results.
All right. Can everyone see the results, or do you need me to recount what we're seeing here?
I can see it.
Okay, great. So you can all see that actually about 40% of the folks on the call today have worked for a CRO. 60% have not. And then do you understand the key differences? And we see a bit of a split there, leaning towards the yes and the kind of. So good. I'll spend a little bit of time speaking about sort of the differences in the company goals and objectives. And so before I move on, let me just ask everybody to go into there using the chat feature and put in a couple of words of what you believe would be the biggest challenges that you would face in moving from what we'll call a pure play CRO, or someone who's conducting and executing studies on behalf of a sponsor, to a sponsor themselves. Let's give everybody a minute or so to enter that into the chat, and then I'll read off some of those responses.
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem, Sonia. So the question was really what you believe would be the biggest challenges you would face in working to shift an organization from being a pure CRO to being an actual drug development sponsor, acquiring assets and moving them through the development life cycle.
Okay.
All right, we have some answers coming in. Let's keep them going. So a couple of themes I see emerging here. One around the resources, who's needed to get the job ultimately done, the processes associated with moving from a CRO into being a drug developer. Some other interesting pieces here around sort of the communication style, maybe even like the culture, and even like the ways in which a management team communicates. And then kind of we finish out here with end-to-end expertise requirements. So yeah, these are all great responses. I agree with each of them. Cultural approach to studies, cultural approaches to development. Exactly, right on. I think everyone's here is grasping some of the challenges that you might face moving over from a CRO into a sponsor. So today we're going to talk a bit about that journey. Let me thank you, Joe, for opening up the chat feature. So let's move on a little bit then. So here's a view of today's agenda. I'm going to take a little bit of time, not so much walking you through the agenda, but give you a little bit of like the historical space of how I arrived here and at this agenda. And so, the contents of today's discussion are really going to be shaped by my experiences, especially this past year or so, challenges that the organization has faced, that my team has faced, that we've worked to collaborate on and overcome, but also will include some of those kind of I would say challenges that we faced, some of the frustrations, some of the incorrect assumptions that have been made that do impact your ability to make this transition. This approach today is not meant to be prescriptive. This is only a specific approach. This is not, I'm not teaching you here for the PMBOK where you have to listen to what I say and actually translate it into the exam. This is, again, just an approach. And I do think that there are many ways of getting from A to B here. Many of us will not go through this exact type of transition through our career. There's only so many companies that have made a shift from being a CRO to being a sponsor. But I think all of us as project management leaders and project managers play a major role, though, in organizational shifts, cultural changes, sometimes informed by key disruptions and other times informed by new opportunities that kind of shake up the world that you live in. And so I do hope as you're listening to this today that you consider your own individual and your own corporate applications. As I think Joe mentioned, sort of the lens with which I'm coming here is really as the third employee to join the organization with a focus in R&D. And so I joined an organization that historically had been a CRO, also played a major role in things like digital patient recruitment. And so I joined the organization at a time where the decision had already been made to move or shift or begin the shift from CRO to sponsor. And so a lot of what you're going to see today is also about my ability to be really fortunate to be in a position to move the organization forward. It's not just going to be all maybe typical project management type work, but in many ways is a representation of the things that we in project management are often pulled into and asked to do. And that's because of our cross-functional expertise, our knowledge of drug developers. And so finally, without getting really too deep into where things are at my current organization, we do have now 3 assets under our responsibility, under our belt, one of which recently kicked off in phase 2 and others which will be kicking off shortly. So we are actually finally seeing some progression, and I'm really very excited about that. Today's agenda has really 6 key topics. The first 4 are really going to be more about sort of the starting point and all the activities that go into making such a transition. And then the bottom piece, assuming we have the time for it, is going to be more about some of the kind of the typical building blocks that many of us are used to seeing as we build out a project management organization, and specifically things like that kind of product flow playbook, as I'll call it. Things like governance, things like strategic development planning, especially things like the team makeup and avoiding silos and bridging gaps cross-functionally. And then we'll kind of wrap it up ultimately with a bow, which is what is the critical role of the PMO through the transition and through the development planning. I want this to be interactive. We have a nice group. I think it's about 20-25 people. So, please don't hesitate if you have a question that you really can't sit on and that you think is going to help move the program agenda forward. Please don't hesitate to raise your hand or put it in the chat function, and we can have a little bit of a side discussion. I don't want this to be me chatting with you for 30 to 40 minutes. So let's move it along then. All right, so let's just start with a bit about perspective, and you're going to see this theme throughout the course of today. And so when many of us think of the perspective in the world of a CRO, the world is really focused in conducting and executing clinical trials. And so when I talk about this today, I'm really thinking about sort of traditional clinical development execution focused CROs. I'm not talking about like sort of some of the newer organizations like the IQVIAs of the world or the Syneos Healths or the Covants who have now expanded far beyond clinical trial execution and do things like medical affairs, asset strategy, market research, commercialization. I want you to think in your mind of coming from an organization that's really focused perhaps in a specific area of the world, who has specific maybe feasibility and expertise to conduct studies, but that's really the primary world with which they live in. And so this is going to be a recurrent perspective during this talk about stepping back and seeing the perspective. And so this is just a little bit of a graphic of showing what the world looks like to people who have maybe come from a much more traditional kind of CRO. And this is really where the world is going for those of us who have been a part of drug development and the transition that we're making with this organization that I happen to be a part of. And so you can see here, you all know this very well. You may not have worked in every single part of within the steps of drug development, but you have a sense of where things come from and ultimately where they lead to. Whereas in maybe that CRO world, maybe it's much more compact and much more finite than what we think of as the drug development world. So let's start with that perspective there. Any questions before I move into a little bit about the differences in goals between a CRO and a drug development sponsor? And this chart is accurate. Wasn't it always sort of like that? Josh, I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Easy if I come off mute.
Yeah, thanks, Josh.
I'm not part of your industry, so a question largely born of my ignorance. But wasn't it always that there were aspects of the complexity that you've got in that chart currently on the screen?
Oh yeah, certainly, Josh. They've always been there. It's just I think when I was speaking about sort of the CRO environment where I'm starting from right now to where we're going, it's been a much more sort of well circumscribed world, where the only thing that really mattered was executing the trials. There was not all of the work that happened in advance to actually, the work happened, but it happened sort of in an opaque black box. And you received ultimately, say for example, a protocol, but nobody really maybe appreciated what went into actually designing that protocol and all the ramifications of what that protocol means for the future.
Okay. So in other words, those other elements are more complex, more risky.
Yeah, far more complex. Yeah, exactly. Far more complex and far, I think, or much less easy to determine sort of timelines, deliverables, and some of the things that we think of in project management that are maybe a little bit easier for us, much more tangible, so to speak, happening sort of in these phases of development versus happening before or in between the phases.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Josh. All right. So let's kind of take a quick look here and talk a little bit about sort of how a CRO differs from a sponsor. A lot of us have worked at CROs or understand how it works. And so at a high level, a contract research organization is a service-based organization that's relying on what we'll call a cost-plus model, where you take, what is the cost of work to be completed, and you ultimately add on some multiple that's going to, allow you to have a profit and hope to ultimately reinvest in the organization for future growth. The work is generally bid on. You're bidding on work that's being outsourced by drug developers who have chosen, for many reasons, not to do the work themselves. The general focus here at a CRO is often at the project level. So it's the individual project with a finite beginning and end that you're bidding on and that you're seeking to complete in the most efficient way possible with the highest quality. And then ultimately the goal for them is to really rinse and repeat. And so it's to demonstrate the value of your execution and retain the customer. And I think the key consideration here is that the goal for CROs often is to maximize that project-based revenue, again, to reinvest perhaps in technologies that are focused on your ability to execute, and then continue to build that line of business. But really, as much as perhaps we'd like to all believe that the ultimate outcome of the study matters, to a CRO, it doesn't matter as much as it does to a drug developer. Of course, we all want positive studies, but really the CRO is going to be paid regardless of that drug's outcome. And assuming they've done their job, they can wipe their hands and they give the product back to that developer. And that's a bit of a simplistic view, but here we look at sort of how that's different from a drug developer, or what we'll call a sponsor, who has ultimately been created to develop and or acquire assets to move ultimately further afield in development. So a drug developer is often building far broader R&D capabilities. You saw that sheet before with all the things that are happening before and after clinical trials, and we'll show you some more of that in a few minutes. The focus of a drug developer is often at the portfolio and the asset level. So while individual projects are important, they're ultimately laddering up towards a broader deliverable. When we think of sort of the innovation focus on the contract research organization side, we really think about their ability to execute as quickly and efficiently as they possibly can in that one particular project. Whereas with the drug developer, a lot of the innovation historically has been focused on drug discovery. Maybe it's perhaps picking the right assets to acquire, and then maybe more broadly, the end-to-end development efficiency. But again, much more broad focus, much more longer-term goals. And the end user, whereas at the CRO, the key person you're trying to ultimately keep on your side is going to be that sponsor. The sponsor is ultimately trying to develop products that are going to meet the needs of patients, meet the needs of physicians, regulators, payers, advocates, and other individuals involved who are your key stakeholders. And so that end user consideration also is going to shape that development strategy. And so, as we all know, the goal of a drug developer is to invest in the long-term development of an asset and ultimately to achieve that long-term revenue stream through sales or perhaps out-licensing. And they're only successful if the drug makes it to market. That CRO is really looking, as we stated before, to bring in revenue. They're actually a revenue driver and a revenue creator. An R&D organization is really much of a cost center until that product actually makes it to the market, where it's turned over to the sales organization to start bringing in revenue. So these considerations, while there are similarities in some of the work that we do, these considerations do have a major impact on how we move forward in that transition from a CRO to a drug developer. So one of the things that when I joined the company, there had already been the decision to move forward or make this transition from CRO to drug developer. But many of us sometimes will join organizations where, in fact, we're going to play a key role in these organizational shifts and changes. So this is sort of a list of my sort of top 10 things that need to be done to ultimately ensure a successful organizational shift. Number one, clear communication. So the success, to me, of change begins with clear communication. Every employee at every level should really understand what the new goals of the organization are, why they're important, and how they'll be achieved. Leadership commitment. The leadership team needs to be committed to the new goal and provide ongoing support, recognizing that these are not going to be easily accomplished. They also ultimately, as leaders, we as leaders and the organizational leadership really set the behavior and the tone of behavior that it's going to take to make these kind of shifts. Employee engagement, employees need to be actively involved in the change process. This is not something you can just force on people. I think as many of us know, a key element that you're going to see here in this presentation is the whole idea of training and development. So if new goals are going to require new skills or knowledge, then it's really the responsibility of the organization to provide the necessary training and development to those individuals you have, and also to augment your current, workforce with the people who are ultimately going to allow those changes to happen. It helps the employees actually adapt to the new goals and ensures that we have the abilities to achieve them. Incentives and rewards. So it's important that we reward employees for adapting to and achieving new goals that can motivate and embrace and are individuals who are willing to embrace the change. These rewards could be financial, which is a place all of us go to in our minds, like with bonuses or raises, but they could also be non-financial. And that includes things like recognizing, extraordinary efforts or great efforts to support change, or also even increasing responsibilities. I got a question from Sonia in this. I think maybe this is a bit of an older question. In this model, is the CRO obtaining their own assets to develop? Sonia, so in the model that we are talking about now, the transition, we're moving from a CRO that was currently working on behalf of other sponsors to becoming a sponsor of their own and acquiring assets to develop on their own. Just to finish this slide out a little bit more, supporting cultural adaptation. It's not just good enough to talk about this, you actually have to support it. And so the new goals need to be aligned with the planned company culture, and the company culture needs to be shifted to match the new goals. Not so easy, far easier for me to say it in a couple of pithy words, but this actually takes quite a lot of work and a lot of time. Change management plans, having a well-structured and detailed change management plan can make the process ultimately smoother. This includes the risk assessment piece, the clear timelines, roles and responsibilities. And finally, the last couple are just really around ongoing monitoring and feedback, things that are very, complementary to what we all do as project and program managers. And finally, perhaps the most important thing is having patience. So changing an organization's goals is often a long-term process. We are still in the midst of it ourselves, and being patient is key, especially during the early stages of the project. When in fact, the progress may be or feel very slow, and where resistance may be highest. And so just something to keep in mind as you begin one of these transitions. All right. Let's move this along a little bit. So we've talked about sort of how we actually arrive at where we've been and where we're going. And so this is really like a prior state of the organizations that a CRO might entail. You really have a heavy focus on the operational aspects of development. I'm actually going to use the laser pointer here. Can you guys see my laser pointer okay? Great.
I can see it.
All right, thanks, Vivian. So the CRO organization, at least from the perspective that I'm coming from, and that pure-based execution-focused CRO, is really a combination of operations, the technology that supports those operations, some of which are insourced, others that may be outsourced and overseen by the CRO, and finally those support staff, those things like finance, HR, legal, information technology, not so much technology to actually conduct the programs, but to support the organization. Whereas that's what sort of in my mind is what we have from a CRO, where now the future state is actually to add in a research and development organization. So not something done simply, but the ultimate goal there is we retain this other experience, we bring in an R&D group that has end-to-end subject matter expertise to acquire, drive, or develop, acquire, and develop assets fully. And so one question I often get is about where does operations fit in? And so in our organization, currently operations sit separately because that's historically where they've been, particularly as the execution engine of the organization. But we are thinking in the future state that the operations group will join the R&D organization, as is much more typical in the industry. So now we've talked about all these pieces of the history and the background. And so what are the things that you need to do as a program manager, as a program leader, a program head to get started to actually move this thing forward? And so there are a lot of questions here, and ultimately there are a lot of tools that you can consider to help you guide this kind of change management process. I'm not going to read every question to you here. I think the key things I do want to mention, though, is obviously this idea of learning and leveraging from past experience and understanding the capabilities, and then the way in which we actually go about assessing what are those capabilities? How do we have an honest conversation about exactly where we are and where we need to go? And so you're going to see tools listed here that you've seen before during the course of your career, whether they be SWOT analyses to look at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, to the new organization or the emerging organization. What are our performance metrics? So, how have we in the past defined and tracked key performance indicators? Are those KPIs going to be appropriate going forward? And many times they're still going to remain here, but now you're going to actually expand your world from clinical trial execution to something much broader, which is full-scale drug development. Employee skill assessments. This is one that gets people a little bit concerned, but this is actually a really important thing for developing the future, which is to really evaluate the skills and the expertise and the qualifications of the organization's employees, assess whether they possess the necessary competencies to be able to transition, and gather feedback to ultimately, help people design learning plans that will allow them to have the knowledge that they need. Finally, a couple other pieces here just to mention. On the key question side is what knowledge do we possess as a company versus individually? So these can differ rather. This can actually be quite different. Individuals in an organization are ultimately there serving that organization at that time. One of the things that can be really revealing is as you start sort of surveying your employees, finding out what their other experiences are, what their other experiences have been, and how that experience can actually be leveraged for the future. The final piece here in this getting started, kind of switching back to the tools that you might use as we kind of begin for this transition, is also like understanding where employees are in their minds. I was shocked that there were some individuals who I came across who really had no excitement at all about moving over into becoming a drug developer, who were very happy at their existence in a CRO world, whereas others were like thrilled to feel like they could play a role in actually moving products forward, not just from the perspective of doing it on behalf of someone else. And so garnering that employee feedback as well as those stakeholders is really going to be critical to your success. And this goes for, again, not just coming from the CRO perspective into a sponsor, but also any sort of major change management activities. I'm going to go, there are a couple of questions here that I'm going to hold off till the end because I think it'll be easier for me to add them then. Is it, and Sonia had one question though, is it a small boutique CRO that's making this shift? I would say it's a smaller CRO, but not so small. I wouldn't call it quite boutique, but these kind of transitions have been attempted over the course of the years. Generally though, it's going to be by smaller to medium-sized CROs, Sonia. All right, I have a little note here. It's kind of supposed to be like your sticky note, which is kind of key things that I have to remember when I've been doing this in the organization. And that means including dedicating the time to evaluate these questions and the tools. This is not something done overnight. This is not something done over a span of weeks. It's really probably at least a couple of month endeavor to do this well. Ensure clarity in the questions. Again, you're going to be operating in a place where people are going to be uncomfortable. They're going to be concerned. They may not even understand the words that you're asking them. And so you have to make sure that we give people the time to actually complete these assessments in the right way. Allow people time to digest the question. Share findings in a non-judgmental way. I think this is something that's really critical for all of us. We come with our own perspectives and we think, well, maybe someone's going to be successful in the organization or someone's not going to be successful. Right now, it's really about information gathering. And finally, to be patient. Now, we talk about all these great ideas to get started. One of probably the hardest things is making sure we actually write it down. So I had a business professor who used to say, when all is said and done, everything is said and nothing is done. And so what I want to make the point here is being transparent about the information that we're collecting during that getting started phase. If we don't write it down, if we just kind of have discussions and talk about it and try and form our own gestalts, it's not going to actually prepare us well for the future. And so it's also important for the organization to see that kind of transparency. So again, by following the steps that I talked about before, you really can create, if you write it down well, and you have people who can write things down in a non-judgmental way, you can create a valuable and comprehensive repository of the findings and the learnings that contribute to the overall knowledge in the organization that existed and where we're ultimately going. So this is a fun little example of how, in fact, this shift from a CRO to a sponsor can ultimately result in some really funny discussions. This in fact, is just a a little anecdotal piece about how, you know, we have an example here of a word or a word in the Oshiwambo language, and Oshiwambo is a language that's used in Namibia by the Ovambo people. And so I was looking up some sort of linguistic, you know, research or manuscript articles, and came across this idea of where the word congratulations, which is a word we all recognize, used in different contexts. So in this example, at a wedding party, and another example, when someone has a baby, and and in this case, at a celebratory ceremony, can actually have very different meanings when they're directly translated. And some of them are kind of funny. I thought this one, "Do not burn the baby," or "What brought us the children," was kind of funny. But this is an example of where the language that we use, we all have context for in our own minds. We all have expectations about what that's going to mean to somebody else. But these results kind of show that some translations cannot maintain their primary meanings with direct translation. And so the place that I wanted to start with you here is like this whole idea of like, what is a product? And I'm coming again from an environment that's been, for me, very much pharma focused, and coming into what we'll call a tech-enabled CRO. So these are kind of like what you think, or I think of as a product, as a drug developer or a sponsor. And so I see words like the drug, the molecule, manufacturing, substances, ingredients, maybe medicinal chemistry, IP, investigational product, things along those lines. When you come to a CRO that's maybe basing their platform on technology, what actually is what's meant by a product is actually quite different. And so this, in fact, in the organization I became a part of, product was really around the technology, the platform, the data, the engineering, the software, all those pieces. And so I remember like one of my first meetings when I said, "Oh, we're going to have a discussion about product," I was like really excited. I'm like, "Oh, wow, they understand CMC, they understand drug development." And I was like kind of shocked when the discussion was really about technology platforms, and product engineering, data capture, and so on and so forth. And so these are the kind of things that can happen when you're moving from one type of organization to another. So as we kind of like leverage that experience and that knowledge that we've had, or the knowledge of the transition that we have, we kind of take a step back and say, okay, now we have to begin the shift over. And so let's develop a growth mindset as an organization that's going to allow us to kind of upskill our knowledge, our people, and our processes. And so for us, you know, you begin with like the idea of trial execution, which is kind of the stabled CRO work, to actually the building blocks of drug development. And in fact, if you've never worked for a drug developer, or you haven't worked across multiple phases of an asset, you know, between sort of the stages or between the actual studies, it's actually a very hard area to get to know. I guess if we take a second and just pause, you know, what was it like for, maybe if someone wants to share if they like, but like when they first joined a drug developer and they started like hearing all these different terms about protocol design, clinical trials, type C FDA meetings, health agency interactions, health technology assessors, all these words, all these ideas that come together that we think of as in drug development are not meaningful if you don't have the context. And so does anybody want to share a little bit about what their like kind of initial experience was like moving into drug development without having been a drug developer before? Vivian?
Yeah. I mean, you can call me Viv. So my first experience in drug development, it was like learning a new language. I understood clinical trials. I understand drug safety. When you walk into those different mindset of the leadership that I had to work with, they started throwing out a lot of acronyms, a lot of new terms where I wasn't used to. And so with that said, I told the team, like, you know, it's great that you guys are really passionate, but do you have a glossary? Is it something that I can reference to? And so with that, we decided to put a glossary together for the whole company, because leaderships are always on these meetings and they throw out these terms and acronyms. Not everyone's going to know. So I have had that experience and I thought it was funny, and I shouldn't have laughed during the first meeting I was there. But I just like to be approachable. And I told them, it's like learning a new language. And I think this would be helpful for not just us, but for new hires and really the whole company themselves. So hopefully that was helpful.
No, that's right. That's exactly right, Viv. I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's actually, it's not an easy thing to teach people. There is a lot of kind of jargon that's being used. And so one of the challenges for us was actually upskilling our people to understand like what actually happened in drug development. And so we had individuals come in to teach courses. There are now multiple training sessions that you can get online to help you understand drug development. But again, that's only going to take you so far. It's actually, I think, still one of the pieces that's missing, which is like sort of rigorous training in drug development, remains, out of reach to many people if they don't have a chance to actually be a part of the industry. And so, we did have to do a lot of that kind of upskilling, but also start to develop learning plans for individuals to understand other aspects of development. So as we continue along this developing a growth mindset, we have the people. So what capabilities and experience do we have? Leveraging the work that was done before to look at skills assessments and knowledge and experience. And do we have what we need? And if we don't, then how are we going to get them there? And then the final piece is really about sort of the processes. When you're a developer of drugs, you're really responsible for the end-to-end process to move the product forward. As a CRO, a small or medium-sized CRO, you're really focused on execution, where you're ultimately kind of having things thrown over the fence to you to then execute on. For example, a protocol being one of the biggest ones that we all think about as probably one of the most difficult things to develop, depending on the asset, that often the CRO doesn't see sort of how the sausage is made to arrive at a protocol. And the fact that that protocol ultimately is going to not only shape that clinical trial that's being executed, but it's ultimately going to shape the future for that product. The ability to actually move it forward in development, the ability to actually bring that product from late stages of development to commercialization. And so maybe you don't have that viewpoint when you're involved as a CRO, because you're just focused on the execution piece. And so here, our process redesign has really been a major effort that's been underway over the last year. And that's based on defining new objectives, mapping sort of the current processes, analyzing sort of those processes to see how they can be augmented, or do we need new processes? And then actually updating the process, monitoring them, and continuing that continuous improvement to find the right processes that meet our new needs. And so just to kind of move things along a little further, this was just an example really about, again, what the experience is often like on the CRO side, where a sponsor will send an RFP, the CRO bids on it, they conduct the protocol, and the drug is ultimately provided by the sponsor to the CRO. The execution of the trial begins, be it phase 2 or phase 3, sometimes even phase 1 programs. The last patient, last visit occurs. Ultimately, the database is locked and transferred to the sponsor. The project is closed out and the trial execution is complete. So that's a very quick way of looking at like sort of what is that life cycle like for a CRO? You're not involved in top line results. You're not involved oftentimes in writing clinical study reports. And then certainly you're not involved down the road further with, say, agency interactions. And so then there's that big shift to what actually happens for a drug developer. This is the way I've kind of used a slide I've used to show the organization. Number one, sort of the complexity and the stages of drug development. Up above along the top, some of sort of the key milestones that exist during the course of drug development that other individuals might not be aware of, that they even exist, these key milestones. And then this other one is about the subject matter expertise. And this is just a slide that I've often used internally to kind of show that, drug development, requires a force of individuals who have different expertise, but that also know how to collaborate to move the product forward. And so when you're coming from that kind of CRO type world, you're maybe only using 2 or 3 of these types of skill sets and this type of expertise. And now you have to expand. And it's not simply enough that you can, just bring these people in at the end, like commercial, for example. What I show here is that these individuals in commercial, medical affairs, health economics, they actually can be, you could actually bring them in as early as, phase 1, but oftentimes they're really brought in at the juncture of phase 1 and phase 2. So moving right along here, as we continue the transition, what are we already good at? And so in my case, the organization already has done a terrific job with trial execution and operations. They've built some of their own technologies that allow us to be successful with respect to e-consent and patient-reported outcomes and CRFs and things along those lines. And there's also a track record of success. So you take these and leverage them, and then you combine that with some of the other skills that the organization exists. And this is really more from a project management perspective, where the software development part of the organization that I came from really has great experience using things coming from a much more agile environment. And so how do we harness that agile experience their use of, they have their Kanban cards, they have their development methodologies, they have their daily stand-ups, they have their minimum viable products, things that to me were maybe unfamiliar coming from a more traditional drug developer, but are something here that's been used quite successfully over the years. And so one of the things that we're in the midst of right now is actually bringing Agile into late stages of development. This is just a quick look at the slide that I showed before, plus sort of like, how do we move over? And so how do we take the knowledge that we've learned in the past to apply that towards increasing process agility, improving cross-functional collaboration, breaking down silos. And so this is one of the kind of very project management-ish type things that we're in the process of doing, because for me, I come from a much more waterfall based project management environment with Agile kind of seeping in here and there. But here now we have an organization that's actually been doing Agile Agile software development to support CRO work. That actually kind of blew me away when I first saw it, just to see like how they were actually using Agile. And so now we're in the midst of actually starting to use that internally as well. So just a quick progress check. We have about 15 minutes left or so. I've walked you through sort of the CRO goals and sponsor goals, some of the pieces about making the transition, how the past sort of informs the future, assessing the knowledge and capabilities of the organization, and then ultimately leveraging that experience to support what has been an unfamiliar goal. So the last little bit is going to be a bit more traditional PMO type things rather than the change management piece. And so this is about building an R&D organization and that product flow, and then our critical role. And I do want to make sure I give time for questions. And so let me kind of wrap this up pretty fast. Foundational elements of a drug developer. So, we talked about the people within the project management organization or program management organization, as well as broadly across the organization as well. Work, how does work get done cross-functionally, and then do we have the right tools? And so these are the questions that you'll have to be asking yourself as you begin these transitions. And so this is a pretty traditional look at the starting point for our project and program management office. Begins with program managers, a PMO head. And one of the things that I've always been really a fan of, partly because of my own personal history, is as you have assets that are being developed by an organization, to have a dedicated program head, especially for phase 2 assets and beyond. Phase 1, perhaps you can get along fine with somebody who's coming from a functional department, but I really like for these phase 2 and beyond programs to have a dedicated program head who's going to be leading what I'll call the PDT, or the core team, the program development team, core team asset strategy team, and really becomes really the voice of that asset across the organization. And so there's a major leadership role there. But again, it's one of the things that I like. Not every PMO has a program head responsible for an individual or a couple of assets. But I find having those people within the project management group has really helped us as an organization. And then, of course, the tools and technologies and the templates, as well as the workflows that are going to be helpful. So PMO's role in shaping how work gets done. We talk about our role as assessing the current and future assets. And so for us, it's been about where are we as an organization and where are we going? Having the right team members at the right time. So that means establishing, like, what does it actually mean to move an asset forward? Who do we need? What's the subject matter expertise? How do we design the team appropriately? These are all things the PMO can play a major role in. Then ultimately, like, assuming these teams are successful and they're operating, what does our governance structure look like? What are the kind of the strategies and templates that we're going to use? We don't want each team having to start from scratch. We want things that the organization as a whole can get comfortable using, that answer the right questions, that allow assets to move forward. And then ultimately, what are those decision support tools used by governance, but also the teams themselves? So here's our drug development lifecycle again. You see this little icon here, which is where, in fact, myself and my team had a major role in ultimately supporting building out the entire drug development organization. I had said to Joe earlier, probably in the past year, I've interviewed more people the last year than I ever had in my entire life. And that was including interviewing people in areas that you see here: statistics, regulatory affairs, non-clinical development, so on and so forth. And this is where project management, knowing and being experts in cross-functional dynamics, can really help to make sure we hire the right people who not only have the right individual experience, but also ultimately have the ability to work cross-functionally. Things that we've done over the past year to sort of move our teams forward, which is number one, starting with empowered cross-functional teams. And you can see a pretty traditional diagram here, where at the top you have program development teams who are responsible for driving the asset strategy. And that's across the entire asset, all indications, formulations, so on and so forth. You have maybe dedicated sub-teams that are associated with, in our case, clinical sub-teams, CMC, and regulatory. Then we have what we call our execution teams. And the idea here is that there's continuous alignment back and forth, ensuring that the ultimate program strategy is well understood by all members of the team, but that the actual work that's happening on the ground is also aligned with that broader program strategy. And then on the side here, you have your functional partners, which are your functions, and that's ultimately where people are being pulled from for you to move your development assets forward. And you also have a vendor oversight group. This is just a quick look at some of the things that we've established for our PDTs. And then here's our governance board, something that's important for the organization as we bring in new assets, as we acquire assets, as we develop them, is having that board that's going to be there to provide formalized approval of the asset strategies that these program development teams espouse, make sure that the strategy works across the assets or across the entire portfolio at a high level, managing budgets and timelines, and then also in between when significant changes arise, bringing that back up to portfolio governance. This is a bit of a quick look at why we established portfolio governance. At the end of the day, it's really about setting a tone for organized decision-making, accountability, and communication, and also setting reasonable thresholds with which the teams can work, but also giving teams the opportunity to get on with the work that they need to do once they've kind of crossed through that governance structure and have the okay to move forward. To me, if a team is on track with their strategic development plan, then they're generally speaking, unless something significant happens, the team should be left alone and they come back to governance at specific stage gates, which we'll talk about in a moment. These are our SDPs. This is something that we've spent quite a lot of time doing, which is actually developing templates so people know what are the key elements that are going to be needed to move an asset forward. It's ultimately a living, integrated, comprehensive document. Many of us are familiar either by helping to complete strategic development plans, update them, when major things happen, but also communicate the vision for the asset. And then the final piece is obviously our stage gates that represent the pivotal decision points. These are things that many of us in project management take for granted, but are absolutely necessary in helping drive an organization to becoming a new drug developer, to understand kind of how this all fits together and that we have the right checks and balances. And so with that, I've gone through sort of the critical role of the PMO through that transition and planning. We talked about sort of organizational alignment and change management. We spoke a little bit about how we leverage the experience, assess that experience, and then create pathways towards learning, upskilling, and ultimately success. And then also how we support the organization in driving how the work gets done. And so in summary, just to finish up with 5 minutes left, these transitions are quite challenging and they require a lot of patience. But if you take the necessary steps to prepare and initiate and support them, you can be successful. And we as project managers, we as project leaders, those of us representing PMOs play that critical role in establishing PM excellence, enhancing efficiency, reducing risk, and ensuring ultimately successful project delivery, and giving the organization the framework to be successful. So with that, we have about 5 minutes left. I'll take a look at the questions and open it up for any final questions and comments myself.
Jordan, this is great. I really appreciate the scope of the presentation that you gave. You covered a lot of things, everything from setting up a PMO at any organization to setting up a PMO at a company that you're converting from a CRO to a sponsor organization. A lot of great stuff in here. There are a few questions that I want to point you to. One from Salam here. Based on your experience, what is the lead time required to make the organization change before you acquire the first asset?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that came from Salam. So when I guess the short answer is, I would have loved to have had a solid 6 months to even a year to actually have begun this effort towards a transition, just because it has been so significant. We ended up acquiring products pretty fast after I arrived, so we were sort of doing that, building the plane and flying it, that we talked about earlier today. And so, I think 6 months, if you actually had 6 months of dedicated time to do this, it sounds like a lot, but to actually build out all the processes, hire the right people, build out the learning plans, and actually, get people working, on assets in a broader way, I think you can do it in 6 months, if in a dedicated way.
And related question, so after you have the asset and you're developing it, at what point do you look to sell it off? This is a question from Kate.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think it's still that's a question. I think we're trying to move our assets along. Get them to a point of value inflection. We acquired assets to move them along, and so that's what we're doing. I think whether or not we ultimately bring them to commercialization is still a question mark. It's still to be determined, but what we're really trying to do is move these assets forward so that they become even more enticing, ultimately to the patients and the prescribers, and bring it into the marketplace.
Well, that's something we'll watch and see what happens with TrialSpark over the years as hopefully successes come. And then, Becky's question, how large is TrialSpark? And I think, related to this is you've built a pretty mature project management organization and governance structure. A lot of companies of a small size, 100 or so, don't have this level of maturity. So maybe that's where the question is coming from.
Yeah, so I think right now TrialSpark's about 150 people, and there's probably about 40 to 50 that are more or less dedicated towards, R&D. Some of which, we still have consultants and contractors that we work with as well to augment our forces. But maybe it's 40 people or so right now within R&D. So it's been quite rapid growth, and there's still definitely more room to grow.
Excellent. And then you had a slide about the program heads, and you mentioned the importance of having dedicated program heads. My question was, are they dedicated 100%, or are they, for example, like a medical director that spends part of their time being a program head?
Yeah, good question, Joe. Yeah, my goal is to dedicate them really 100% to the assets that they're responsible for. I'm also using them to help us kind of build out the organization because of their expertise. But yeah, they're not residing in any other function. They're residing fully in the PMO and are fully dedicated to the assets that are their responsibility and leading those teams.
That's great. We'll open it up. We have 2 minutes here. Any last minute questions from the audience? You can come off mute and ask.
I was just going to ask if you can share some contact details. It would be useful to be able to follow up.
Yeah, of course.
And there we are.
Thanks, Josh.
Jordan, thank you again. Great presentation. Really happy to have you represent the PIP-MG webinar series. I can't say enough how much information was in here. I think having the slides and people will be able to go back and watch the presentation again. We can glean a lot of information. And please do reach out to Jordan. You can see he has a wealth of experience and information. And I think, Jordan, you'll be joining some conferences coming up. So keep an eye out for what Jordan will be doing with some of the conferences on the East Coast. So thank you all for joining. And thank you again, Jordan. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everyone.